welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill. And today we have author D.L. Tillery, and we're talking cosmic horror, death, and madness. So I'm going to let her introduce herself. So take it away, and then we'll get right into the questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm author D.L. Tillery, the Mistress of Horror. And over on my YouTube channel, I talk about all things horror, do my book tours, and all my writing things that I have going on. I specialize in horror. Cosmic horror is my niece. I really like cosmic horror, so I guess that's probably why I'm here today. I do have a few horror short stories that are out and published, and I have another one coming this year, and my debut novel is a dark fantasy. So as you can see, I always stay in the dark side.
Yeah. Okay, so for anyone not familiar with cosmic horror, it's Eldritch Gods, outer space, cosmic grandness. And so when you're crafting killers in a cosmic horror story, you have two types. You've got the basic human killers that are trying to bring about the Eldritch Gods rebirth or whatever.
Yeah.
And you have the Eldritch Gods themselves. So tell us the difference when you go about that.
So for one, like Eldritch Gods are for the most part beyond like comprehension for the human mind, which I think works out really well when you're talking about creating horror around eldritch beings and things like that. When they're enemy, well, I guess I can't really say they're enemy because humans don't have much of a chance against eldritch beings, but tend to be, I would say, the eldritch beings, the whatever the enemy that they seem to go against most of the time. And most of the stories that I have seen, rarely have I seen where eldritch beings are going, against other. Well, they do go against other eldritch beings, but other beings of other natures in most cases. But those stories are interesting to see as well. But a lot of times it's humans, I guess, because again they can break the human mind. Eldritch beings, their abilities and ways of thinking could be limitless and unimaginable because they aren't grounded in our humanistic reality. So you really have to be, if you're a writer of it, be careful with your human mind because you can kind of, that stuff can get integrated, and you kind of have to try to let go of those humanistic thoughts when creating the mind of an eldritch being.
So it's like Eldritch Gods. We're just like little bugs, and they just squish us, sort of.
More or less, you kind of can think about is if you compare us and ants, maybe kind of that concept. Ants are very intelligent and have very developed societies, but they're really not much to us. I mean, granted, we could just end them in a millisecond, like they would be nothing. So it's kind of like that, really. To Eldritch God, unfortunately for humans, especially when going up against one in a story, sadly.
So if you're writing a human killer in the world, like a lot of the stories have Eldritch Gods have worshippers and whatnot and things like that. How do you go about their motivation?
I think that if I do integrate that in my stories, and of course I've read plenty that have, um, it's just mostly it's easy to do that because what else in some sense would a human do with an eldritch being? Worshipping them would be easier to go to because of the power that they seem to, possess. And in order for sometimes the humans to deal with that these things exist, it would be better for them, their mind would figure to worship it because then it might not want to end you.
Well, that does bring us to the other possibility, which is not worshiping it and going straight into the madness. So tell us a little bit about the madness of being.
So the psychological and madness being, intertwined in that. Madness in itself is kind of its own hell, really, when you think about it, because you don't always know that you're going into madness, and but you're drowning in it. And then in that course, that brings up things like dread and the fear and things like that. Psychological part of cosmic horror is such a big part that sometimes I think it also can get misconstrued of, that psychological horror is also its own thing. But it's just that psychological horror is so ingrained in cosmic horror because of the eldritch beings and how when you integrate the humans that it all intertwined because the human mind not be able to take the existence of these type of beings and these beings playing with the human mind. It happens a lot with the cosmic being eldritch stories because of if you place a human in the story, most time, like I said, there are humans in the story, that the madness is going to play a big factor because also there's a connection between when eldritch beings enter a human realm, the whole our whole reality can't accept their existence. So there's this manipulation that occurs in the world and this distortion that happens just because the eldritch being is present. So you'll notice in some stories that the world becomes a little warped and things, and then that madness sets into the human minds, kind of like a virus. So,
Good analogy. I like that.
mm.
So, tell us how you build the dread in when you're killing off a character.
Usually, and dread is laced in fear. So kind of like a tease, and a lot of people say like my horror has like a bit of a tease and slow burn to it to build up to the climax. And that's kind of like me playing with the fact that it sometimes takes a little bit of time, even if the human may know that, their fears, they're afraid that this dread is building up because of the inevitability of not being able to do anything. Fear is connected to the ability to not fight against this thing, especially when we're talking about creatures and things like that.
So, when you're crafting the death scene, you're creating the atmosphere. Does setting play a role in what you're doing? Like,
Oh, definitely. Setting is a very big deal because it pulls the reader in if it's a book, and then it pulls the viewer in if it's a film. The In a film there would be music that would help bring the setting to life. In a book, it would be your description, how the area is, what it looks like, what time of day it is, just the foreboding of the character, maybe others around them's personalities, as well as being brought into the setting. And it's just a kind of like a you're doing a layout. Your setting is kind of like a blueprint because you look at all the things underneath that build up to the surface, and it's just everything. Like if you made your setting in the dark woods or something like that, how would the moon cast it down? How would it beat off of the water and the lights that are around? You don't have to put all these details in your description, granted, but it should be in your head because it's going to make you, the writer, feel the setting yourself, and then it kind of comes out through you into your words, and then the characters emotions that are being affected by the setting. As we know in real life, we are all actually affected by our settings that are around us. Like if we are in a room that is messy and it's completely chaotic, it's going to change our mood, and the setting of that is going to affect us. So that's the same concept of when I'm writing a story and I'm making the setting, and that setting definitely again affects anything that like the kill and all that, the death and all that stuff. So it leads up to it. So definitely setting's a big deal.
so when you're killing off characters, what sort of weapons are available in cosmic horror, and what are your favorites?
I would say the weapons, the best weapons are the psychological ones, because what you do with the weapons is you dig into the creature that you created, the eldritch being possibly that you're using at the time, and you, like I mentioned earlier, try to remove your humanistic thought process. And that's not the easiest thing to do since we're human. But when you're writing, you in your right horror, you kind of have to do that. Kind of just like when you write a killer that is a human killer, you're not a killer, but you have to like kind of get into the mindset of what I would do if I were. So what would I do if I were an eldritch being that wanted to torture a human? And a lot of the things about a eldritch being thought process compared to that of a human killer would be completely monumentally different because of a human's mind of drive to do those things, and an eldritch being's drive to do those things. It may be something as I'm bored, or that's like the most used of a eldritch being. I was bored, or just for my own enjoyment. So if you thought about something for your own enjoyment and you were bored, what things would you do? And why would you do them based around being bored and just maybe your pure entertainment? Why do we look at certain TV shows, or why do we eat certain foods that give us enjoyment? You kind of have to think about that when you're thinking about the mind and weapons of a eldritch being. If their eldritch being has tentacles, or if your eldritch being has certain claws, or lots and lots of eyes, or whatever you would think that would break a human mind. This is how you build your eldritch being, which the eldritch being itself is the weapon, really. Because if they go in and break the mind, that's the best weapon in the eldritch horror. Just distorting the world is also another weapon. You kind of have to think about eldritch being's main weapons as chemical warfare, if we talk about human words. Because if humans use chemical warfare, then it's not something a human could grab and stop or break, because it's in the air type of thing. So if you thought about eldritch being in that way, if they let out some kind of poisonous gas, or a hypnotic type of gas, or they injected you with some kind of fluid or something that would later mutilate you from the inside, or make your mind break to attack other humans.
I like that. That's cool. Cool analogy.
Yeah.
So, how much of the sci-fi versus the occult mystical do you put in your stories, and how do you balance it?
That's a very good one, because sci-fi is laced in horror. Like, it really is. It's it's kind of like that thing that they say about Christmas, when they say that Christmas is laced in pagan DNA or something like that. So it's kind of like that, because sci-fi is laced in horror DNA, and it's a fine line. You can go completely sci-fi and not even touch on the eldritch being setting, cosmic being setting, which would be easy to do because of the setting of sci-fi in general, but it still has that taste of horror in most sci-fi, if you notice. So integrating that into any kind of cosmic and eldritch horror is very easy to do because of that right there. But a lot of the times when I write my cosmic horror, eldritch horror, I don't always touch on the scientific or sci-fi version part of it, especially if I'm on our plane. I don't bring it into play as much. Now, if I was going to go outside of our planet to show maybe some of the history of eldritch being, and then I probably would in that case, since a lot of the eldritch beings would come from another planet per se, or another galaxy or something like that. Something our human minds couldn't yet have figured out, though we do space travel thing, but we don't really understand it, to be honest. And this eldritch being does. So that sets it above us to begin with. So it's a fine line where I kind of depends on the premise and what I'm going for in that story, what I would do with sci-fi versus just the standard cosmic being, like cosmic horror setting. So really depends.
Okay, so you're crafting the death scenes, how much of a balance do you get between the psychological and the gore, as if you would? Do
Yeah.
you add the gore, or is it all sort of off page?
I would say it would depend on the creature. It would depend on the being that I'm envisioning for the story, how I would go about the um like the graphical violence of the kills, or the psychological horror elements of the kills and deaths and stuff. That really depends on what the creature would be doing in the story, and what's the outcome going to be. Since I'm an outline writer, my stories are already blueprinted through for the scene, so I always know the end before I even wrote the story. So the end definitely plays a big part of how I've been going this whole entire time with the graphical kills. If it's graphical violence throughout, and then that's usually the staple of how I'm going to write this book. And I'll maybe put little taste of psychological elements in it, just because it is all eldritch horror. But um, it could lean more towards the other way, and I could go more psychological and some of the graphical violence could be there as well, but it may not be happening. You know what I mean? But it felt like it happened to the protagonist or whoever in the story. So I like to mix them a lot of the times because I like to write gore. I do I do like to write gore because I like to do like really specialty kind of kills a lot of the times, or something very elaborate because it's coming from a being that's not on our plane. So um that really will depend. But and personally, I like to intertwine them and give it a nice balance most of the time. I may ease up into it with the psychological of getting the tenseness of the setting and everything together, and then bam, I might just hit you with some terrible murderous scene that is bloody and gory and no one can take it. So that can have surprise.
The best kind of surprises. Do you utilize the killer cult mentality that often goes with cosmic horror, or do you prefer like a sort of a one-on-one versus the human versus the eldritch being?
Um, I like watching those, and I've read quite a few, and a lot of the times they go with that. And again, like we talked about earlier, I think the reason that they do that a lot is because of the human mind breaking, and sometimes um they figure that humans may go that way, and if there's some being that is above us to that point, humans prefer to worship it than fear it. So they decide to go that route. And this, they go too far because then it becomes, the cult thing. It's not a religion. It's it becomes an occult. So being a cult and then worshiping the eldritch being to the point that they may be like at this point hurting people, or doing blood rituals and doing all these different types of things that could occur. It could be some very creative type of things in the cults that would be worshiping a cosmic being, because it really would depend on the lore of your cosmic being, like what it likes. One of the best type of representations of eldritch beings to me was this video game that came out on the GameCube, which is like a long time ago, and it was called Eternal Darkness. And it has like it has the madness, the fall into madness. It has three different eldritch beings in it that kind of go against each other, and kind of want to just play with people, and from what I could tell. And I think one of the ones is called Churchurger. So they have these very specific names, and you have all these symbols and things that's on there. It's playing. So you have like this book that has all these different writings in it and blood. Some of it's the Book of the Dead. So you'll see a lot of like that type of play with it, and people having prophecies, and they have worshipers on here to the point that they were just like, were people at one point, but then they get infected by the eldritch beings, and then they turn into something else, which happens in some of these stories with eldritch beings, which again, that's that chemical warfare setting and that infection and a virus setting that can come as a weapon from the eldritch being. And so yeah, I just it's so many things you can do with cosmic horror that it was always very enticing to me, because it's limitless, really, kind of like how the eldritch being could think, which is scary as well.
Okay, so what was the most creative death you ever wrote for a character?
Ooh, there's so many. So many things you can do too. And so many I still have coming. One of my favorite, I have two favorites, but two of my favorite ones is imploding. So the how implosion works, and also dissolving of organs and bones from the inside. So that type of death, that was like one of my favorite ones to write, and it took some research on anatomy because I didn't want to do it wrong. But of course, when you go into um like supernatural things stuff, you don't have to follow our humanistic rules again, because some things are unimaginable to us of how they can occur, because they start bringing in magical things occurring and not just our way of how things work without human weapons and tools. So those are my favorite, like the melting from the inside and implosion, because it's very, very odd.
And I would think messy too. So
Very, which I like.
Okay, so what's the oddest thing you've researched relating to writing a character
Ooh,
graphic?
I guess maybe the oddest thing that I've researched probably was based around the imploding thing. Because you try to, you look it up and you figure out like how that could occur, especially in our reality. So I usually, when I look at things that are going to be supernatural, I look them up in a reality based setting. So like I just look up the first, I always look up the definition of the word to make sure I have the exact definition down, because the dictionary is your best research, actually, still to this day. So I look up the definition first, and then I take all the different, words that's there, and then I look up the definitions of those, and then how do you use this word, and then I look up, what this word is connected to as implosion, like, when something implodes, and how would it work. So how would that work in the human body, how would it work in, just different structures and things like that. As I really, research is a rabbit hole. You could go pretty darn deep, so I always do research separate from when I'm writing, because then I won't get any writing done. The dissolving one was definitely one of the most, I guess, weirdest or interesting ones, because of how, dissolving would work, especially if dissolving just happened of air quote natural causes. That would be a phenomenal, because it'd be no, if a person just walking around and then they would just dissolve from the inside out. Very messy too. So that would be my favorite ones, or weirdest ones that I've researched, especially if someone just, again, checked my search engine. They'd be like, what is she doing? Why is she looking up that? I'm a writer. What can I say? I write horror. Look
Yeah.
up weird things.
Okay, so do you have a favorite research site or a go-to book?
Um, I don't. I don't have a specific research site that I go to. Usually, when I research, I just, I Google the words, and like I said, and I later look into them. Tend to like to use, but it's especially anatomy. I have anatomy books in my personal library that I like to use. I'd have to pull them up and get the names, but generally, it's usually medical books. I have quite a few medical books because I like to get the exact wording, and it shows the pictures and things like that of how the human body is built and how the organs function and things like that. It's good to know the basis of things and how they function in order to learn how to tear them down and destroy
Yeah.
them. Um, so if you know how something was built, it's much easier to destroy it. That's with anything really. So if you are going to break the human body, knowing how bones are set and where their weak points are is useful, just so your mind knows it. You may not mention these things in your writing, but if your mind knows it, it also knows how to destroy it, even though destroying is much easier than creating. So um, I like to use anatomy books, especially if it's going to be anything with me killing humans and something, so I can see how I would take them apart, or how the monster would take them apart. But let's just go ahead and say it, that our monsters are an extension of us because we created them. So um, I definitely would recommend, if I was recommending research, if you're going to be writing horror, definitely look into anatomy and how the human body is built. Because we learn some of these things in school, but we don't really go into in depth unless we're obviously going to go into the fields, that
Yeah.
require those things. But we decide to become writers, so we may not, know the details. So there are plenty of books for you to learn these things. And the other things that I like to research, I research a lot of werewolf lore and vampire lore, so a lot of supernatural type of lores, and there aren't going to be a lot of air quote resources for those that are, because they're not going to be factual a lot of times anyway, but there are a long history of lore. And I sad to say that a werewolf lore tends to disappear over the years. Um, Stuff that I used to be able to find a long time ago, which I really, well, even bookmarking wouldn't matter if the websites aren't currently available. um Taking notes is good for your research, because it might not always be there, because it was someone's ideals for that lore in a lot of the cases, even their old things. So a lot of the times, if I'm writing fiction that has humans in it, I still try to go away from our reality, specifically because I don't have to follow our rules. and you don't have to have that coherent facts of our reality, because those things apply more when we're going to be grounded in our world. A lot of my stuff, especially when it comes down to cosmic horror, is not grounded in our world. It may be relatively related, but I usually like to use parallel worlds and stuff, which of course is bringing in science fiction and things like that. I prefer to do that because then sky's the limit. I created this world completely, even if I am going off of some of my human knowledge of where I currently reside as a human on Earth. So even if I take Earth as a basis, my worlds, like a good example is my story Astro that's going to be coming out as a dark fantasy. It is horror-esque though, because since dark fantasy is nothing but fantasy and horror mixed together, but my world is based off of our world, but it is not our world. So people get to know that as they read the story, because I don't want those limitations. You won't ever hear New York City in my stuff, for instance. I don't like using our words of places because I don't have to worry about, oh, well, in New York, there's this specific building, and she said she was on Light Street, and then it's not. That's not going to happen with me, because I don't like to use our human world places and things like that. It could be based off of it, but it definitely won't be called it, though. A good example, again, from my story is Drodic City, which is one of the main cities in my story, is based around New York, but it is not New York. So you won't hear Times Square, for
Yeah.
instance.
Yeah, that's kind of why I like writing alternate history, because I mean, it's based on the real history, but you can change it. And if you accidentally get something wrong, well, that's how it was in my world.
Exactly. Like technically this isn't wrong for me. That happens a lot also in fantasy, because as you know, fantasy writers have, like, the people that made stuff for them more or less. You have people like J.R.R. Tolkien, who created pretty much the whole elven type of setting, like the elves, the elven language and things like that. And as you can see in fantasy, a lot of fantasy writers use all of those things. And it's great to have that basis there to go off of, but you're going to have people who have been into fantasy a long time frowning at you if you go and try to change Elvish, let's say, because, since it's been used so long and the person who made it, you changing it's going to make people frown. It's interesting when you make up your own stuff. So I always tell people, like, go for that. Like, it's okay. And I'll see a lot of writers off subject. I see a lot of writers talk about, like, they were questioned and asked, like, can I do this? Like, is it okay? I'm like, I don't ask, like, is it okay that I melt a human from the inside? Because I'm going to do it. I mean, I'm just saying, we're writing fiction. It's okay. Like, I'm not going to ask you. I'm just going to go melt them.
Okay, on that lovely note, we'll end the interview. And I'd like to thank you for being here. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you for having me. Always love talking about horror.
Yeah, and that's the end of another episode of Words That Kill. And so bye for now.